Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Word times together. We've been studying in the midst of 1 Kings 19, looking at an episode in the life of Elijah that illustrates for us how we get ourselves into times of discouragement and depression, how God meets us in the midst of it and takes us back out. I want to begin our reading today in verse 13, where we left off yesterday. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars, and they've killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it." And the Lord said to him, "Go and return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." As I say, we've been studying the nature of discouragement and depression in the life of the believer. We began by, in the opening part of the chapter, looking at some of the triggers that set us up for times of discouragement and times of depression. Then we turn attention to some specific steps that can be taken, slippery slopes, slippery steps that get us down into the pit of discouragement and depression. And then more recently, over the last number of days, we've been looking at the issue of how God meets us there, at the bottom, in the midst of the discouragement and the depression. Now, today and in the next couple of days, as we finish our study, I want to talk about what this passage in 1 Kings chapter 19 reveals to us. God is speaking to us and saying, this is how you come back out again. We know now what he does in the midst of it. How do we come back out of it again? Let's look at those things together. And the very first thing that we encounter is that God says, I want you to reconsider your situation, but this time having my lens, having my perspective, looking at it through my eyes. It's interesting, as we saw Elijah kind of came to his senses, saw that he hadn't been looking at things quite right, and he came to the mouth of the cave in humility. We find God asking a second question to Elijah. And in a way, ironically, it's the very same question he asked him earlier. Why are you here? Why are you here? And we saw earlier even, that wasn't like, why are you here at this cave? But rather, why are you here in discouragement? Why are you discouraged and depressed and so low? Actually, in those verses I read to you today, Elijah responds to God's question, and he responds with the same words, essentially, that he responded the first time. He explains again, hey, the problem is the people of Israel, they've thrown down your work, they're rebelling against you, they're attacking the prophets, I'm one of them. And there's no new details here. So the question is, what was the purpose of asking the question the second time? It seems at first glance kind of confusing. What's changed between verse 9, where the question is first posed, and verse 13, where it's posed again? What's different? Why does God ask it a second time, knowing the answer, the details are going to be the same in both particular cases? What's changed? Has anything changed? The answer is yes, something tremendously important has changed. The circumstances haven't changed, but Elijah has changed. Let me repeat that. The circumstances haven't changed, but Elijah has changed. What's changed in Elijah? Well, as I already say, it's not his circumstances. Israel is still in rebellion. People are still seeking his life and so forth. What's changed as a result of what God was doing with him in the midst of the pits is that Elijah's view of God changed. Not the circumstances, but his view of God. He could see God differently now. When we see God differently, it doesn't change the specifics of the circumstance. Seeing God properly didn't mean Israel was seeking God instead of being in rebellion. Doesn't mean that Jezebel isn't after your life. And in your world, to see God properly doesn't change the fact that you're facing this illness, or that loved ones are hurting, or that you're facing financial struggles, or whatever other form some of the discouragement in your life takes. You see, what changed is what we do with the truths, with the data. Here's the situation. If I don't see God properly, it's going to cause a certain outcome in me. Here's the same situation, but now if I see God differently, there's a different outcome. And there was a different outcome in Elijah's life. He now saw God differently, and it changed everything. He could look at the same circumstances, the same objective truths about it, and have a different response. Seeing God properly was critical, central to his facing his fears. Seeing God properly was central, important to facing the discouragement he was feeling. Seeing God properly was crucial for overcoming the despair. He sees God properly. Brothers and sisters, there is no answer to the discouragement in our lives when we face those times if we don't see God properly. And there is no way we're going to see God properly unless we are understanding who he is as he's revealed himself in the scriptures. That is why we study the word. That is why we listen to teaching on the word. That's why we're in it in our own lives, in our daily devotions, meditating, reading it. We have to see God properly in order to properly handle life circumstances. Do you catch it? I hope so, because that was the first step back. Looking at the circumstance again, but through fresh eyes. The data of the circumstance was the same. In other words, my life's still being sought. Israel is still in rebellion. But now what I do with that information is changed. Has your perspective been transformed because you're seeing God as he is and as he's revealed himself to be, rather than seeing him in too limited a way? I hope so. The second part of this stepping back into getting life moving forward was that he had to see and had to accept that God was still in control of the circumstances. The Lord said, go back, return on your way. It all builds out of what I looked at the last time. Do you believe God is still in control despite the disappointment you're feeling? Do you believe God is still in control despite the discouraging life circumstances you're facing? Let's put it in the terminology of the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. Do you believe the whisper in which God is showing himself is as powerful as the wind, the earthquake, and the fire? Can you trust God's control and sovereign purpose in the midst of life circumstances? Elijah was now able to go back to resume the role that God had for him. We'll talk more about that role as we get in the next couple of days. But he was able to go back finally because he now understood that God was still in control. He now understood this so important conclusion that God doesn't have to work according to my scenario in order to be in charge and to be at work in the circumstance. In other words, what I envisioned God to do, because he didn't do that, didn't mean he wasn't in control. What was wrong was my perspective. It wasn't wrong to have a perspective, but it was wrong to, when it doesn't end up happening, to believe God's out of control. Rather, the right conclusion is, well, how I expected God to work isn't how he chose to work in this situation. He's still in control. Do you see how dramatic a difference that can make as we look at our life circumstances? It made a dramatic difference for Elijah. The destruction of my own understanding of how God should work, how I want him to work, doesn't mean God has abandoned the situation. It doesn't mean that he's not still in charge, that he's still not demonstrating his power. We can live above circumstance when we believe God controls the circumstances. And if we're his children, he has reasons and purposes in them. This particular lesson is a repeated lesson throughout the scriptures. I hope you're understanding it. Number one, today, are we seeing God properly? And number two, are we believing God is still in control of the circumstances, even when the circumstances are unhappy ones, and even when he's not working within the circumstances as we expected him to? Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to look at how we climb back out of the pits. I hope today has been helpful to you. God bless.